The Fancounters Celebrity Podcast, number 146. Coming to you from nowhere near the entertainment capital of the world, this is the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast.
You were like the carrot top of interviewers.
Wow, how disappointing was that question?
You did not just ask me that.
It's a very big question.
Never mind, I'm done. I'm not doing the show.
Wow, I can't believe it.
I'm telling you, I'm hooked.
Nick.
Yeah, he's so awesome. He's a good friend of mine.
Welcome to the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast. My name's Nick. Thanks so much for joining us again this week. We've got a great celebrity guest for you. Like we've heard many times, we've done the actors and the people that actually worked on the show in the soundstage for the new Leave It To Beaver. Today, we're going below the line. That would be people who worked on the production and after the show was shot. We're going to talk to an editor today to learn about that craft, how they edit for film and television. It's going to be a great show, and we're really glad you're here. You can follow us on social media if you go to Fancounters on Facebook. We have a private Facebook group there, too, called Sharpie Nation. And, of course, we're on Instagram at Fancounters Live. Sitting again to my left this week, the getter of the guest, Brian Nelson Jr. How are you?
I'm doing well, Nick. How are you?
I'm okay.
Awesome.
I'm only a little disturbed this week. You don't want to ask me why? He's scared.
I think I'm going to get a tardy slip and sent to the office, I think.
Well, he was late. I can't find out how to get to you. You've been here 6 times. You should know. Apparently not. But that's okay. No, that's not where I was going with this.
Well,
actually.
let me defend myself a little bit here. I usually when I come here, and this is, I know it sounds kind of shysty, but the lighting was a little bit different.
Oh, give me a break.
And
it's still light out at 5 o'clock.
And I did well in a different vehicle was in the parking lot or in the driveway. Well, I was drinking some Sunkissed orange. It was,
Sure.
But that, yeah. And, I came from a different direction this time. So I was totally turned around. But enough excuses. Excuses. I do apologize for my tardiness.
All right. Well, I'm not disturbed because of that. There's a lot of things that podcasters do to bring some notice to their show. One of them is reviewing other podcasts with the iTunes username of your show. So Fancounters, of course, has a iTunes account. And yes, I did go and honestly review some podcasts, maybe to get some attention. Mostly they were very sincere about podcasts that did a good job. I know last week I ripped a podcast that I listened to a lot and like a lot, but for good reason. And I played clips to show why I picked on it. We won't go back into that. You can listen to last week's show if you want to know what I'm talking about. So do you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast?
No, I don't.
All right. Well, he's the biggest podcaster in the history of podcasts, right? He just signed like this $20 billion deal with whatever. And I mean, he's like one of the only guys making money at this thing.
I'll have to take a look.
Okay. So here's the deal. I did honestly review his show. I listened to it. I thought it took me a long time to listen to Joe Rogan because I know that he has an interview format show, and so do I. And I've been doing this now for 3 years. So it's not like I just started and I was like, oh, Joe Rogan, I want to be him. I'm going to start a show. And it's not like that at all. I didn't even know who this guy was. So I finally listened to a podcast of his. Do you know what the first 8 to 11 minutes are? Guess.
A bunch of rambling?
Ads.
Oh, no.
11 minutes of advertisements before he even says hello.
I think I ran into one of those. And I had the same thought,
I'm just like, seriously? I'm like, I get that you can play ads before your show and make tons of money, but holy crap, 11 minutes?
Yeah, I think there was one posted on one of our pages. And I listened to it, and like you said, it took forever to get to the interview. I thought, is this like...
Our listeners are saying the same thing right now. You guys are rambling. Get to the interview.
Yeah. But yeah, it just seemed like, is this like a scam, or is it just like spam being put out there? Because I was going to keep it on the page. It looked good. And then I kept it on there because I did find the interview. But I did tell everybody that it's going to take a while. You might want to whiz through that and go in 10 minutes late into the interview because... Yeah, I think I ran into that same issue.
All right. Well, a couple things make a great interview. Great questions. For hands down, this show's got great questions. We do a lot of research. Okay. And I keep saying I do a lot of research. Now, you did a lot of research for these Leave It To Beaver interviews, but with every other guest on the show, I'm the one writing the questions.
Right.
And every single time, the celebrity's like, well, I'm really glad you came prepared. I'm glad you came researched. These were really good questions. Things I'd never heard before. The amount of times a guest says, oh, wow, on this show is a ton. So we do a really good job vetting the guests and interviewing them. So that's the number one thing, is great questions. A good personality is another good thing. And I think, I'm going to toot my own horn here. I think I have a pretty good upbeat personality. Yeah. I've got people in the peanut gallery watching us today shaking their head, but you're wrong. So those are the two things that make a great interview. And, Joe Rogan has those things. He does ask really good questions, and he is pretty passionate about the people that he brings on most of the time. So I reviewed him, and just saying, the ads are crazy. I don't even remember what my thing said, but here it comes. On my page, I have a review from somebody who saw that review and came to my show to listen, which kind of was the point, right? And he says, I came here to try and find out what made this person think their podcast is as good as Joe's, and I still don't understand. The review they left on his show seemed like they just couldn't figure out why their podcast wasn't as successful. Maybe they should have more interesting guests, or just not be upset at others' success when the person they think they are like has been doing it so much longer and has developed their following over time. I'll give them a try, though. At least they made a podcast and are trying to get it off the ground. It's more than off the ground, but thank you, Larry. Hopefully new guests may be a little bit more intriguing, and their fan base will grow as a result. Well, I am sorry that Kristen Bell has said no to me 68 times. I have tried. Okay.
You did try to get Tim Allen, too.
I've tried. I get more no's from the A-listers than I want to admit. But we're getting there. But I do think that we're discovering lesser-known actors that work with these big stars that are just as good.
But you know what, though? I think, whoever took that the wrong way, a lot of reviews, I think, especially negative ones, are looked at as like venting reviews where you're just spilling out a bunch of negative stuff. Where in this situation, it just sounded like, I enjoyed your interview. It was just some constructive criticism.
That's true. Now, Joe Rogan, it looks like he releases a show almost every day, Monday through Friday. I guess he's got 1,541 shows. So if you do the math on the 1541, it looks like he's been doing this about 6 years. So he's got 3 years on me. Maybe we'll catch up. You never know.
Maybe.
Okay. I just wanted to share that with you. So no, I'm not thinking that I'm better than Joe Rogan. That wasn't the point. The point was, Larry, you listened to the show. Thanks for being here. We do appreciate it. Moving on to the show this week, we do have a wonderful film editor and author on the show. She is best known for her editing genius of the new Leave It To Beaver. She's also worked on projects like Max Headroom, Lassie, the 90s version, and Family Matters. And we're going to talk about all those topics today on the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast. And then stay tuned after the show, because guess what we're going to dissect? The Zack Morris Podcast. Is it good or not? You'll find out after Gael Chandler on the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast. Gael Chandler, welcome to the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, you two.
You bet. Now, Brian and I have been very good at getting everybody involved with the new Leave It To Beaver on this podcast, kind of a virtual reunion of sorts over the last few months. So you are the next installment in this cast process as an editor. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, we want to know, how did you run into this opportunity, and what was your feeling landing a job with such an iconic cast on a very memorable television show?
Well, I came on in 1985 in October, and I had been to Universal and had my resume in, and because I had been in videotape and not just film, I think I stood out. So it was kind of proof that you can get a job in Hollywood without knowing someone. And that's Pete Ware called me in, and we had an interview, and the rest is history.
Cool. Yeah, we just had Peter Ware on the show a couple weeks ago, so there's a familiar name to our listeners.
Yeah.
Now, Brian's got a specific question about an episode to ask you.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that that was your first job was the new Leave It To Beaver, seeing as that's what I'm pretty much involved in with this reunion. Being an editor, I'm wondering how did that work with specifically with the episode Gosh Wally, specifically with editing the 1988 Wally into the 1958 scene.
Yeah, well, that was a lot of ingenuity on the writer's part, and it was a lot of fun. It was clear it was one of the better shows when I was cutting it. And Brian and I were both nominated for Cable Aces for that show, and he won for directing. But at the time, they put multiple cam, or we weren't multiple cam, but they put comedies in with multiple camera concert shows. So I was up against the Michael Jackson show one year, slightly bigger budget, slightly, more material. And another year I was nominated, I think it was for Perfect Harmony, and I was up against Gloria Estefan. So it was kind of, I kind of knew going in I wasn't going to win.
That's tough competition.
But it was an honor to be nominated, that a comedy even made it in.
Yeah.
So,
can you tell us kind of how that's done in the 80s when you're matching footage from two different eras together? Like, I mean, you were doing it digitally, right?
Well, it's part of what I think I've listened to everybody's interviews, and this, congratulations for going below the line for the first time. And the new Leave It To Beaver, and it was not my first show that I worked on or edited on. I started as an assistant. I was there for a couple of seasons. And then Brian promoted me, which was, really fantastic for me and in my life. He really made a difference, and I'm always grateful. And at any rate, Beaver, New Leave It To Beaver broke ground in terms of editing because it used an editing system that had never been used. At the time, film was being used on the lot, which was Universal in California. And most of the shows, were on film. Magnum PI was there. I think there was Airwolf and some others. And they were all 35 millimeter. Well, we weren't in quite the same league. We were cable, and we were edited on a non-linear editing system. And we shot on 16 millimeter, so we weren't even shooting on 35, but we did not cut on 35 like all the other editors. I mean, I was actually in a different building, and editors aren't known to the cast of their own show, and I wasn't even really known to the other editors because I was off in a room with the system that was called Ediflex. And Ediflex, it sounds so primitive now, but at the time it was breakthrough. It had 8 VHS machines that worked together.
Oh my gosh.
And it actually was on a computer. There were 3-inch discs. That one was the program disc, and one actually held the show. And each line of the script in each, I guess it was by act, was given a number, and so that was programmed into the computer, and it was called the script mimic. So you could hit line 5, and you could get Beaver's close-up and Ollie's close-up and a master, and you could play across and see all of them, or you could play down the whole scene when you had cut it. So it was basically a grid system. And you used, instead of a grease pencil that a film person would use, you had what I used to call my magic wand, and it was a light pen that you tapped on the screen. And actually later I was one of the few that got one that you just pointed and the light hit the screen and it cut the picture.
Wow.
So one VHS would take, Wally's and Mary Ellen's two-shot, and another would take a master, and you could play through a scene like that.
Huh. That's pretty neat to hear the inner workings of actually how you edited, way back before everything just was a digital file.
And actually, to be honest,
I mean, this was a pre-digital system. It was breakthrough in that it was non-linear, because tape had been linear before this, and which meant that each shot had to be recorded one after another. And if you took out 2 frames from shot A, the whole business had to be recorded from that point on. Whereas nonlinear was like film. You could jump anywhere you want. You could add, you could subtract, you could move. The drawback was on a show like Gosselaar, you couldn't play through a scene. The 8 machines just couldn't make it, because there were some 2-frame edits in there when Wally has his flashback with the roller coaster and everything like that. So you'd have to, you'd have to play it out to 3/4-inch tape and look at it. And that was how we screened everything, was you played a show out to 3/4-inch tape. I'd take it up to Brian's office, and we'd look at it. I'd get my notes and go back to work.
So that begs the question, and you mentioned that sometimes the cast doesn't even know who you are. Did you spend any time on that set getting to know the cast or getting the feel of how the episodes were being shot?
I didn't. I mean, typically, some editors like to go to the set. Some editors make it a point of pride of never going to the set. I like going to the set, but the truth is you don't have enough time. On editing on Beaver, it was a 6-day-a-week job for an editor, and it was a breakthrough job for me. So I was working really hard. I didn't take lunch. I worked through, and I cared a lot. And but as a result, you feel it's very funny, because I remember seeing Ellen Maxted, and you'd see them on the little monitors. There were 8 monitors that matched the VHSs. And so I felt like you feel like you know the actors.
Sure.
And then, of course, you go on the set, and they're like, who the heck are you?
You could even say to somebody like Ellen, I've seen every moment that you've ever spoken on this show, and she has no idea.
Yeah, and you feel like you know them, and you don't, of course. And but that's part of what being an editor is you are the independent eye. You are not connected to how hard it was to get a shot, or somebody had a good day or a bad day, or there was a fight, or whatever happened on the set that day. You're just looking at the footage and what works and what doesn't to tell the story.
A lot of questions we get are about when the series moved to Florida. And as an editor, did you make that move as well, or is that all footage that's sent back to you to compile in Los Angeles?
No, I was happily surprised when I was taken to Florida, and Peter Smokler and I flew out together. And he's another one he was the director of photography and did a terrific job, and he would be another really interesting person below the line to interview. But anyway, I flew out to Florida, and again, everyone was in one building, and I was a couple buildings away. And, probably a 15-minute walk. So I was kind of buried there. But I went on the set quite a bit more. And in Florida, I think, most people did not have their family or their partner there. Mm-hmm. So we all pulled closer together when we were there. And I know you may have questions, but one thing I thought goes along with what you've heard about Brian is that he not only tried to get everybody from the original cast in the new show, but he also tried to get people that were involved with the original show. And he pulled in Dan Kahn, who was an original editor on the original series in the 50s.
Wow.
And so Dan and I met at the office at Universal Studios, and I'm sure he had to probably approve me too. But Dan Kahn was legendary because he had also edited the I Love Lucy show. And you can look him up online. I mean, he ended up giving a lot of talks because I Love Lucy was a multiple camera show. And in those days, you had one moviola where you cut 35 millimeter, but you have 3 cameras, so it was very hard. You had to put in one reel with one camera and edit it, and then another reel. And he strapped 4 moviolas together, and they were called the Monster Moviola. And he's in a film legend because of that. And I have a picture of him in my new book with that, actually. And and I learned from Dan. Because what happened was, Ediflex, you had to have an assistant doing the script mimic and putting all the dailies on the tapes and playing out the shows, and then you had somebody editing it. And Dan just couldn't get it. He could not understand how to run the system. So I ended up having to run the system for him, and he edited, and they hired somebody to do a great part of my job. And which was his downfall because it was too expensive, so they couldn't bring him back. But they loved his editing, and it was great for me because if you've ever wanted to learn editing, as much as you're motivated, to me it's like watching paint dry. But it was fantastic for me because here I was in this, comedy editor extraordinaire's head, having to go, okay, if he goes to Ollie, what am I going to do? And, I was learning the system. And so it was a bit stressful on both sides, but I got it. And I got in his head, and I could anticipate where stuff was going to go. And then he helped me cut shows. He deliberately didn't work on shows. Like the birth show, I did quite a bit of that, and they knew it. I mean, he got the credit, but he had to leave the show, and I finished it up. And after that, they started having, I started cutting shows with him and then with the next editor who came on. And it was the greatest way to learn, because they say, comedy is all in timing. So if you can cut comedy, you can cut anything. And so I felt very fortunate.
Who puts in the laugh track? Was that you?
No, the laugh track. One day, another fabulous person that Brian brought on was, or actually Pete, I think, hired, was Lori Modier. She was an associate producer on the show. And I have, as everybody else has talked, I have some lifelong friends from the show. And they're in post-production because that's who I was hanging out with.
Sure.
Although it's great to be on your site, Brian and Scott. Site to reconnect with Cindy and Janice and stuff like that, who I got to know Janice in Florida. But at any rate, the laugh track, which no one wants, and you have to, it was forced on many a show, including MASH, so there are a lot of famous shows that had laugh tracks. Anyway, the laugh track in those days, I got to see it one time, this little old man. He was probably middle-aged, which seemed old to me at the time, probably in his 50s. He wheeled in this little machine that had titters and guffaws and roars and everything else, and he just went through the show and inserted them from his machine.
You had mentioned that Brian Levant did everything he could to get as many of the original players, whether it be cast or crew, and ones that he couldn't get in there, he paid homage to many of them. Mary Ellen's doctor was Dr. Tokar after Norman Tokar. They also squeaked in Huber Whitey Whitney Jr. as one of the credits. Yeah. We spoke to Brian, and yeah, he's a fun guy to talk to. I get the feeling he's like a big kid.
You nailed it. I think Brian Beaver is not just the inner Brian, but the outer Brian.
Yes.
And he was a sort of a boy genius. He was an incredible writer, and he would talk to you in this Soto voice, and he'd say, "Do you know Gail?" And then he'd gossip about somebody, and I'm sure he did it about me. But one of the things that I appreciated was one day he said, I gotta go up to the tower. You want to go? And the tower meant seeing the quote unquote suits, the executives in the it was actually a high-story building, whereas, Brian was in a bungalow. Most of the buildings were sound stages, but the tower was like a corporate building. And I'm using these words because this is the way the crew looks at the executives. And I'm sure they look at us in just as flattering a way. But anyway, so we went up with the cut, and Brian sat down, and he wore high toppers, and this was late 80s, so he was kind of avant-garde in his footwear. And he sat down, and he stuck his 2 feet on the executive's desk. And they didn't, they just went on because they knew it was the art versus the business right there on the desk. And, and we needed them to make our show. Every year on Beaver, we thought we were going to be axed. I mean, I remember in 86 it was, I hope we're not 86th in 86.
Right.
Yeah. Which when you're in a situation like that, it's nice to know that you went from 86 to 89, which is a fairly good run when you're just, especially, I mean, you weren't involved with the first season, but when they were supposed, Disney Channel just axed them right away. And then TBS just ups and gives them a contract for multiple seasons and a record amount of shows at one time.
Yeah, it was it was amazing. It was great to be carried on, and yet it was the kind of thing where I still to this day people go, "What? I mean, you've already made 100 episodes and they've never heard of the show."
In this business of editing, what would you say for yourself anyway? What is the hardest thing you need to do while processing a film? What is the easiest?
Probably the hardest thing is when you have two people that aren't getting along. If you're not getting along with the director, if you're not trusted, if you're abused, and you're reduced to what editors call a pair of hands, where they sit there and they snap their fingers or they say cut here or cut there, and there's no trust that you bring something to the table. Tony Dow has written the foreword to my new book, and he talks about that a lot, and that was his take in the foreword, in which I let him write about anything he wanted in the foreword. That's what foreword writers get to do, and Brian wrote a very wonderful, irreverent one to my first book. But everyone brings something to the table, and I think that's the hardest. It's also hard. You always worry, like a director and a DP and an actor, is what I'm doing working? Is it going to turn out? Is it going to all come together? Is it going to be terrible? Is it going to be great? You work hard and you want it to work.
Let's dive into these books a little bit. I want to hear about them because I am an independent filmmaker. I've made a web series, so I've done a lot of the things on a very small scale that you've gone through as far as figuring out when to make a cut and all of that. And you've got a book called Cut by Cut, as well as a new book coming out called Editing for Directors, A Guide to Creative Collaboration. So tell me a little bit about the process of using a book to explain film editing. I have not read the book. It's probably something I should pick up. But how do you do that in a Word format?
You describe the mental approach to cutting. You talk about, because everybody, someday, if you're an editor starting out, and I'm sure you've had this experience, Nick, where suddenly you're the person looking at, now it's a screen, and it used to be a little mobile square, or an Ediflex that was it was a small computer screen. Suddenly, oh my God, how am I going to start cutting? Where am I going to cut to first? What do how do I decide? And you become very nervous. So that is something that you have to engage with the footage to do. But reading a book of how editors approach the footage, I think is very helpful. How do you pick your first shot? How do you pick your second? What's important? What is a match cut? What do you match, and why is it important or not? And what has MTV added to editing? Why is it controversial in editing circles? And there is a lot of also looking at the function of an editor. One of the sayings is there's the show that's written, the show that's shot, and the show that's edited. Mm-hmm. And editing's where the buck stops. It has to come together in editing. It doesn't matter how great looking the footage is. If there's no story or the performances are flat, it's going to fall to editing to try to make it all work.
I have to ask this question because you are an editor and I am just a casual moviegoer, okay? So when I'm sitting in the movie theater and there's a daytime scene and all of a sudden, all right, well, it's time to go home. And they go home and it's nighttime and I'm thinking, how far away was that restaurant from your house? Does that bother you as an editor when the day and night doesn't always match up?
Yeah, it does. And, you kind of wonder, what happened there.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've been watching Love on the Spectrum, a documentary about people with autism from Australia that's on Netflix, which is, I think, quite wonderful. And that happened. But you know what? It was a documentary, so I think people are forgiving.
Okay.
And I also think more mismatches have been pulled over on us than we ever see.
Probably.
I mean, Thelma Schoonmaker, who's gotten 3 Academy Awards and is famous for Goodfellas and recently The Irishman, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, in Goodfellas, she jumped people right across the room. Suddenly, people are sitting down, and suddenly the next shot they're standing up. It was something like that. It was so blatant. Mm-hmm. I was like, whoa, But I mean, she and other people, you cut for where the audience's eye is, and to a certain extent, you're a magician as an editor. You're wherever the eye is focused, you can get away with stuff. If stuff is moving along, especially if you're in an action scene, you can do quite a lot. You can get away with quite a lot. Because I think if an audience is engrossed, it's more important the continuity of what you're trying to get across than the actual continuity of props and lighting and all that. I mean, lighting you can work with in post to a degree. But a big saver, Nick, is really sound. Sound can, the words of that person, whatever that scene was that the director was talking about. Mm-hmm. I bet you sound that is, smooth and the audio levels are smooth and all that can really cover a lot of ills.
I agree. I mean, you can find a movie that's not so good, that is not so beautifully shot, but if the audio is great, you can stay into it. But if you find a movie that's beautifully shot with crappy audio, you're out of it right away. So I completely agree with you.
And editing is actually, it's a job that is, it's a thankless job. People don't realize a lot of the scenes are made by an editor, because they put the key pieces where they should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's we're sort of like the ignore the little man behind the screen in The Wizard of Oz, We're applauded most when our work is invisible and you don't notice the editing. And that's kind of been the Hollywood rule. There's been a lot of focus on continuity for years. But MTV and the new wave and has really upended all that. I mean, look at reality TV. I mean, yeah. I interviewed a reality editor for Cut by Cut Edition 2 that came out in 2012. And reality editor said, people don't trust reality shows unless they are kind of crappily shot. And they, yeah. I mean, we're all contradictions. And I think that has crept into other editing. I mean, one of the editors I most admire is Chris Dickens, and he cut Slumdog and Hot Fuzz, a comedy, and he just does so much work to make even simple scenes just sizzle, and not fancy and not breaking, jump cutting for the sake of jump cutting, but for the sake of what the piece is saying. And I mean, that's to me an extraordinary storyteller. Certainly past my abilities. But that's what it really boils down into the end, is editors just don't take out the bad, takes.
Oh, they do a lot of adding.
We really are putting the story together.
Gail, so tell us a little bit more about the new book, because it's editing for directors. So is this a book for directors to understand the role of editing, or is this editor's guide to getting along and dealing with different styles of directing?
Oh, it's really directed at directors. And it's, editing, like any other part of filmmaking, it's got its magical parts and it's got its very mundane parts. And this goes into both of them and lets a director know. I mean, the mundane part, one chapter is how do you hire an editor? What do you look for in an editor? Another part is, how do editors actually put stuff together? It also deals with, why shouldn't you edit yourself? And a lot of great directors do edit. I mean, James Cameron and the Coen brothers, they edit their own stuff. But most people are going to turn it over to somebody because they'd rather direct than sit behind a screen, or it just all depends. So, so the book is definitely aimed at directors and really helping them understand the process of post from getting the first frame in the cutting room to color correcting and delivering.
Now, when do you think the book is going to be available?
I wish I could tell you definitively, but it'll be from Michael Weezy Productions, who has published all my film books, and it'll be sometime in 2021.
You've not only done books about filmmaking, namely editing, you've also written a book called Chronicles of Old San Francisco. And this is an opportunity that came to you rather than you just deciding to do the book. So I'm going to give you an opportunity. I want you to tell me a little bit about the book, but my very first important question is, while you were prepping the book, your dad told you to make sure you included Joe DiMaggio in the book. And being a huge baseball fan, I thought I would ask, did he make the cut?
He did get in there briefly. Okay. He did.
Good. So tell us about the Chronicles of Old San Francisco.
Well, I'm kind of a Northern California girl, even though I grew up in North Jersey, and Janice Kent and I grew up very close, actually, in towns very close. But I lived in Northern California in the 70s. I went to L.A. to be part of Hollywood and was there for 31 years. And then in 2010, I retired back to Northern California. And as a result of that, a friend had written, there's a whole series of these books. There's one on New York, Chronicles of Old New York, there's Chronicles of Old Boston, and so on, various cities. So when they wanted to do San Francisco, out of the blue, I got an email from a friend who said, do you want to write this book? And I said, sure. And so that's how it came about.
I know you said you have befriended Janice Kent. We have obviously we've lost many of the cast. We've Dennis Snee on the crew. We just lost. Were you able to work with any of them?
I didn't know that. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. He passed away sometime last year. Yeah. Oh, geez.
Yeah. I saw the name right away and it popped up in a news feed. But were you able to get to know any of these people in any way, or if not, I know you said you didn't work on the set a lot. Were you able to get to know them at any point?
Yeah, in Florida, Janice and I got to be friends, and Barbara took us, all the women on the crew, the ones from California. She took us out to a really lovely restaurant one day. Actually, I couldn't go, but she invited me, and I was really sorry, but I had something that I had to do. So, and then I saw Janice a couple of times back in L.A. A group of us would go out from the show, and then, she had Haley, and she had her daughter, and, that changed her life. But yeah, but the people that I did get to know was, I still keep in touch with Lori, and she's helped on the books. And Jay Sherberth was the editor after Herb and Steve, and after Dan, let's just put it that way. I assisted Jay for a season, and we've remained friends, and we actually created a book trailer company. And I wrote and produced, and he edited book trailers. And we actually did 2 for my books and 1 for a client. I listened to all your podcasts in preparation for today, and it's just amazing to me to think the kids are now almost 50 and have, careers and kids of their own. And listening to the Osmond brothers, that was really interesting, because when we were in Florida, Eric was in high school, and he had to write a project, and he decided he was interested in editing.
Yeah. And
so he came down and interviewed me. And it was really great to find out how well he's done, and that he ended up an editor.
You must have been very inspiring.
I don't know, but it was, of course.
I gave you a chance to take that credit. You missed it.
Yeah. No, it was great to hear how, Brian and everybody, they really helped the kids, and they made a difference in their lives, and vice versa.
Yeah. Now I want to end with a few questions, not about the new Leave It To Beaver, but some life before and after the show. And one project in particular I'm interested in hearing a little bit about. I barely remember the show. I was 9, I guess. I hate to admit it. But you worked on a TV series called Max Headroom, who I know as a former spokesperson or mascot for the Coca-Cola Company. He got his own show. Was he 100% computerized, or was that the editing that made him look that way?
They shot the actor, Matt, what was his name? I can't think right now. They shot him, and they spend a lot of time in post animating the head. Okay.
Did you do that?
No, I didn't. I got Jay, that I just mentioned, I got him hired. I would suggest when they were looking for an editor on Max, and Max was 87 for me, I was on Beaver, and I hadn't been promoted yet.
Okay.
Full time. And so I assisted on Max, and Jay edited a few shows, and I assisted him. I was already assisting somebody else, but I moved over because we'd worked together. And Max I really thought Max was going to take off and be this great show, and the public just didn't get it.
No, not at all.
It was really too bad, because I was, like Peter Ware said in his interview, I sort of wanted to make it more to a bigger show, and I thought Max was going to be it. But it was, Max is a whole other story, but it was really too bad. They just didn't make stories that talked to people. It had a great look, and I think it came from England, and there were 3 partners in England, and the one that came to the United States got sued because he basically ripped it off to bring to the United States. So that didn't help it either. And they didn't know how to tell a story. They didn't know how to make characters that quite related to people. They were just too far out.
Yeah, it was some sort of crime fighting thing, if I remember right.
Well, it was kind of cool. It was very British. Max Headroom, it came from the when you go to a car park and the arm comes down in front of the car, and it says Max Headroom. Well, he gets hit by one of those, and so every once in a while he goes out into this Max personality when he's sort of a Clark Kent reporter, or is Clark? I don't know if he was a reporter, but I forget his profession. But he was something else, more like Clark Kent by day.
You actually worked on another show that was a classic TV show on Lassie. When you worked on that, were you asked to give it a kind of a feel of the old show, kind of a look of the original series?
No, they had a system that wasn't. This was after Beaver, and they had a system where they had a senior editor who finished all the shows and got the credit. And the editors before that did the first cut and the second cut, which is really sort of the hardest because you're looking at everything. And then they had a system where they didn't want you to access all the material, so you had to be aware of the technology more than being able to grab any frame that you wanted. So it wasn't a happy show for me. I left. But the thing that I did learn, and they had a dumb rule that kids can't talk. So you have to have, every time a child is speaking, they have to be on camera completely for every line.
Wow.
And none of the kids on Beaver were like that. I mean,
Quite the
Giovanni
opposite.
Ribisi was a standout as Duffy from an early age. I mean, I went to Pete and I said, Duffy's leaving, and we both sort of, were sad.
Yeah.
But I know he went on to much greater things. But at any rate, the other interesting thing about Lassie was that, the dog didn't do most of the stuff that it needed to do unless they isolated it and did it in a single shot of the dog. But I had a master where all the people did their job, and the dog did the trick right on camera. And I was like, wow, this is great. It's part of the scene. And they're like, nope, you got to cut into the dog to see it. And you could see it. And I just, so you get the idea that was, good for the other people, but for me, it was not a great mix.
Difference in style, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, coming from Brian, who, was very freewheeling, and, I learned a lot. He had a lot of patience, and, I listened, but I was used to a certain amount of, respect.
Sure.
And, I didn't, and also I got another show, was really what happened. So that was a good excuse to leave.
There you go. I'm always curious about this one thing. I look at IMDb and I look over people's resumes of things that they've worked on, and I know that it's not always right. I know that stuff is missing and that kind of thing, but I wanted to just check in with you about Family Matters because it's one of the last credits that you have on your IMDb resume, and you only worked on it in one episode according to that. So I'm just kind of wondering, were you filling in? Was that a situation where you were helping out? Family Matters was a show I watched every Friday night, so I'm just kind of curious what happened.
Well, yeah, what happened was it was thanks to Fred Fox Jr., who was a writer-producer on Beaver, and he pulled me in, and it was a one-show deal.
Okay.
The regular editor, Jim Miley, just like on Beaver, you couldn't have one editor for the whole,
the whole run.
What's the word I'm looking for? Season.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd have to, because you just couldn't cut all the shows. And so they'd have to get somebody else to do they'd have to farm out at least one. And so what they hired me for was to do a first and second cut.
Gotcha.
And I had never edited multiple cam, and I thought, this is going to be so easy. You got 4 matching cameras, and you don't have to worry about any of that. And I learned a lot, and I was able to write about it in my books. But that was the deal. It was a one-shot deal. I mean, I would have liked to have gone back, but what I learned was that it was a multiple camera show. They had an audience. They shot it with the audience, and the audience laughs were really important. Mm-hmm. And you had to know how to work with those laughs, and you couldn't just fade them in and out. I mean, Jim knew how to do a lot more tricks than I did, and I would have come up to speed, but and I'm sure he worked with what I did. But the lucky thing was I got a hell of a show. If you're familiar with the show, Urkel's really the main star of the show. Yep. And on the show that I cut, he plays a female and his regular character. Cousin somebody comes from...
Uh-huh. I remember the episode.
Yeah, cousin, let's call her Edna, comes from Georgia. Yeah. So Southern accent was put on by him, the actor. And I got to... And when he walked out as cousin Edna, it was a showstopper. Yeah. I mean, everybody in the audience laughed for a minute. I mean, it was a riot. And so, but in the editing room and on TV, you weren't going to sit there for a minute. So mm-hmm. you had to deal with that huge laugh, and so that's what I really learned from that show. and how I got pulled in. And again, it was Beaver story. I mean, Fred Fox is a very lovely man.
It is amazing how one great project can lead you in all these other directions.
Yes.
So, Gail, what are you up to these days? What's your update as far as what you're working on now? We obviously, this book, we did talk about that, but are you doing any editing actively, or where does your career stand?
I had always wanted to write. So after we got back from Florida, I wrote my first script. I've written a few others. I'm sure you've heard of them because none of them has ever made it into the theaters yet, but I don't give up. So I'm writing plays. I've loved writing these 5 nonfiction books. Life tends to go in areas in directions that you hadn't anticipated. I mean, I've wanted to be an author since I was in 3rd grade, and you had to say what you wanted. They went around the class. And so it's come out as the nonfiction book so far.
Okay.
But I help a lot of friends. You know, I talk to them about, I read their scripts, or I help them with their projects, and I really enjoy doing that.
I want to finish with this question for you, Gail. In true Fancounters style, one of the questions we always ask our more like on-screen guests are, you're still a celebrity because you worked on such great projects. However, you may not be a face that people would recognize. So has anybody in your inner circle, or maybe you've had an experience with a fan, come up to you and maybe left a memory for you that you'll never forget? Maybe you had a family member say, oh, you've got to get this letter to Jerry Mathers or something like that. Have you ever had somebody try and leverage your connections?
No, I've tried to help people and put them in touch. I took people to the Flintstone set when, Brian was shooting. I took various people to the rap parties who were, I grew up, I was like almost a year older than Brian. So, like a lot of us, we grew up with Beaver.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that was, and the friends never forget. They got to meet Barbara. They got to meet, Jerry and so on. And so that's really my answer. I also wanted to say R.I.P. Ken Osmond.
Yeah.
It was great to see him and sad to see him at the Emmys. But one thing that no one's mentioned in their interviews is they've all said, he wasn't Eddie Haskell in personality, and he was not. But what he did that was really genius was his voice was totally different in real life. It was much lower, it was slower, was not high pitched. I mean, he really created this iconic character, and even as an adult, I mean, you would never have known unless you recognized his face that they were the same person. And I think he was a true creative actor in that.
Well, you mentioned Scott Hetrick before, and he let us put out one of the very last interviews Ken Osmond ever did. And when I was editing this thing and listening to it, I was like, it didn't even sound like him. It was like you said, very deep and scratchy and thoughtful words and slow talking. And I'm just like, it just blew me away that I was even listening to Ken Osmond.
And these kids that he created, these 2 intelligent, lovely boys, I'm just, I never met his wife, but, again, in Florida, I think, everybody knew who the editor was in Florida.
And Christian is a mirror image of Ken, and always has been.
Yeah, I mean, when he was Bomber, I was like, oh my God, he had the wavy hair, and it was great.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time this evening and checking in with us and reliving some of these great stories. It's been a pleasure for both Brian and I. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a blast.
Thank you, and hello to your fans, and I hope you enjoyed the show.
My thanks to Gael Chandler for joining us on the show this week. Brian, thanks again for booking her. I do appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem at all. Thank you so much to Janice Kent, because she is the one that had invited all of her friends that she knows from the show into the page. So thank you, Janice, for helping getting us in touch with a lot of these people.
And promote your page real quick before you go. We're going to talk about this Say by the Bell podcast after you leave. But before you go, because I know you got to run, tell us about your page.
Well, I have 2 pages. The first one is the Leave It To Beaver fan club, and that surrounds the new show, the old show. I'm sorry, the original show. The 1950s and 60s, and then I created the new Leave It To Beaver / Still To Beaver fan page, and that digs into the new series of which we are reuniting cast and crew. Within the past year. Actually, we're coming up on a year since we did Jerry Mathers and Tony Dow, which you can find those interviews on Fancounters.com. And so, those 2 pages, check them out. Specifically, go to the new site, the new Leave It To Beaver / Still To Beaver. It's a very very well done show, and you can actually see episodes of that on the page. And our friend Scott Hetrick, he has a YouTube page that has all of those shows available on it. So please check them out, all of them.
That's the new Leave It To Beaver, Still The Beaver Facebook page. Thanks, Brian, again for being here. And now everybody's favorite new segment.
Nothing better than free advertising. Here is this week's podcast plug.
All right, this week's podcast plug is Zack to the Future. It's a Saved by the Bell review podcast where 2 people watch Saved by the Bell episodes and then talk about them. Now, this isn't just a normal fan-driven podcast because Mark Paul Gosselaar, who played Zack Morris, is the co-host of the show. The problem I have with the show, and I'm not just going to pick shows that I have problems with, but the problem I have with the show is just how scripted it sounded, even from the very first episode. Here's the intro to how they started their podcast.
Welcome to Zack to the Future. I'm your co-host, Dashiell Driscoll, and let's see who's in class today. I have an attendance sheet right here. There is one Gosselaar, Mark Paul.
Hi, Dashiell.
Oh, I see you returned to class.
I did. I returned to class, as you say, because that's what we're in. We're in class.
Now, I do give this show a lot of crap for being what I call scripted. It does sound like everything Mark Paul Gosselaar says is already written down on the paper, and that's kind of what I have a problem with this episode. But I will give it credit because I listened to episode 8, which is their newest one, and it sounds much better. So this could have just been the growing pains of starting a podcast, but what it does do really well is give you behind-the-scenes information, little facts and tidbits about the show that you would not know had you not listened to the episode, kind of like this one. But again, listen closely to Mark Paul when he chimes in. It sounds like his response is already predetermined.
We're going to put this show on Sunday night, right after Family Ties, primetime. So while Saved by the Bell was a Saturday morning show, you guys premiered Sunday night primetime in a family block of programming in an effort not dissimilar to the Pringles dealer, if you will, to try and hook families who would then hopefully tune in next Saturday.
How did that go?
You guys beat Family Ties. It went really well.
That's crazy.
I'm so glad I get to be the one to break it to you that the premiere episode of Saved by the Bell on a Sunday night beat Family Ties, and you were instantly a hit.
So that's a great, interesting fact. Something I certainly did not know, that it premiered on a Sunday night against Family Ties, after Family Ties, which is pretty neat. But here's how the segment continued. Again, pay real close attention to the way that Mark Paul Gosselaar is talking. It's as if he's just reading off a paper, and it's driving me crazy.
Huh. So why didn't we remain a primetime show?
The goal, as far as Peter Engel and as far as Brandon Tartikoff, what they had in mind was always a Saturday morning show competing with cartoons.
Very interesting.
It was very clear that Mark Paul did not get more comfortable as the episode went on. This is kind of middle of the episode here. He brings up a fact about wardrobe. And again, is it me? Or is he just reading this? I don't feel like his heart is in it. Not in this first episode. I think he had to be convinced to continue on with these. And again, he did get better, but this is more from episode 1.
The wardrobe was definitely a character of the show. What was up with Slater wearing a racerback tank with sweatpants and dance shoes in the Max?
Totally.
All right, in this next clip, we're going to hear Mark Paul Gosselaar do some apologizing, but I think he doesn't need to. See, the situation is Zack Morris was portrayed on the show as very possessive over Kelly Kapowski, right? He didn't want Slater looking at her or touching her or having any kind of relationship with her at all. In fact, the possessiveness looking back is a little creepy. At the time, it wasn't criticized. Nobody really pointed out that, Zack, you're kind of being a creep, and the way you're treating her is very possessive and stalkerish at times. That didn't happen. So in this next clip, Mark Paul Gosselaar looks back at that moment and kind of reflects and feels like he has to apologize for those behaviors, even though A, this is a character on television, B, the role was written by adults. He was simply doing a job, doing what he was paid to do. That's what actors are doing. They're getting paid to perform a role. So I don't think they should have to apologize. But Mark Paul chooses to do something different, which is okay.
He's not even okay with Kelly being next to Slater on a trophy. That feels like an adult man.
I blame the writers on that one. I was paid to say these lines. I said them.
No, I'm not pointing a finger. I just mean like that's the kind of energy you bring to your second marriage after your last wife left you for someone on the bowling team who they shared a spot on a trophy. Like, that's not a thought that a child just comes up with.
What I do love about this show, Zack to the Future, is the fact that they will point out the ridiculousness of this ridiculous sitcom. And this clip is probably one of my favorites.
Casey Kasem is knocking on the principal's door to pick up a banner. He's there to pick up a banner for the dance contest, and like a PA couldn't handle that for Mr. Kasem? You're telling me Casey Kasem, pushing 60 years old, is driving around town in traffic to go pick up a banner from the Palisades? I just, in all the realism stretches of Saved by the Bell, that one has been a sticking point for me.
So there are definitely things I love about this show. I'm not hating on it. I think that Mark Paul was a little uncomfortable in the show. I think it got to be a little bit too scripted. But when you jump to episode 8, which was the last episode that just came out, he's much more relaxed and comfortable. So I think this show has definitely grown into something that's very listenable, where episode 1 was really, really hard to listen to. What I don't understand is, in a little bit, we're going to talk about how many people go into making this show, Zack to the Future, this podcast. But what's funny about that is I think they have Mark Paul Gosselaar recording his own phone calls, because his audio, as you heard in these previous clips, is amazing, right? He's in a studio, he's got a good microphone, and now they're going to go to the phone, and they're going to talk to Elizabeth Berkley. And now both of them sound like garbage.
Can you believe that we are talking about that little show we did 30 years later?
No. I mean, and also the thing is, it has never stopped. There's never been a lull in people, like just every generation. It has met every generation since we shot it.
And see what I mean? That's what was really surprising. Mark Paul's obviously in a studio. I don't understand why they couldn't have connected that call so that his audio could have sounded good. Instead, they both were on the phone. And that was really awkward, especially when they made that very strange jump from great quality audio with Mark Paul to him being on the phone. It was very odd.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the reason that's very odd is because I'm about to play you the amount of people that worked on this show, Zack to the Future. It's an amazing list of people. And the fact that they couldn't make even Elizabeth Berkley sound better and put her in a studio so that maybe she's recording her audio and sending it in. I mean, it sounds like the show has a really big budget. Let me tell you, the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast does not have a really big budget. But I think the show sounds as good as it can. And we do get criticized every now and then about our callers and the quality of the audio of our guest. But we do a good job, I think, in post trying to clear that up. We do have a good system for recording the callers, and some sound better than others because it depends how they're holding their phone and speaking into it and that kind of thing. But anyway, here's a list of the amount of people that work on this podcast.
Zack to the Future is a production of Cadence 13. It's executive produced by Mark Paul Gosselaar, myself, and Chris Corcoran. Production and direction led by Terrence Malangone. Editing and mastering by Andy Jaskowitz. Engineering and production coordination by Sean Cherry. Artwork by Kurt Courtney with illustrations by Jeff McCarthy. Marketing is led by Josephina Francis with PR by Hillary Schoof. Thanks to the whole team at Cadence 13 and to you, the listener. See you next week.
So it takes that many people to make the Zack to the Future podcast. So let's go ahead and play you a little clip of what it takes to make the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast come to your earbuds. The Fancounters Celebrity Podcast is a production of First Star Media. It's executive produced by Nick. Production and direction led by Nick. Editing and mastering by Nick. Engineering production coordination by Nick. Artwork is done by Nick, with illustrations by nobody, because they're non-existent. Marketing is led by Nick, with PR done by Nick. Thanks to the whole team at First Star Media, also known as Nick, and to you, the listener. We'll see you next week. Wow, that's a mouthful of people. And I don't have anybody on my team. I think I need people on my team. I don't know. Anyway, Zack to the Future can be found on all podcasting platforms. I do encourage you to check it out, because if you were a fan of Saved by the Bell like I was, it's a fantastic podcast because you learn a lot of the inside scoop. And what you also learn about Mark Paul Gosselaar is he remarkably forgot a lot of the stuff that he shot when he was a kid. He doesn't remember a lot of the stuff that happened on each episode. And I guess when you do over 100 or so shows like this, you do tend to forget exactly what you were like that day. See, I love going behind the scenes and kind of pulling the curtain back on what it was like to make these episodes. But to us, we don't remember what we did 4 Thursdays ago, not off the top of our head. And kind of when he made these episodes, it was kind of like that for him. He doesn't remember exactly what he was thinking in that moment, unless something very memorable happened. If you got in a car accident 4 Thursdays ago, you remember. So there you go. It's Zack to the Future, and I do encourage you to check it out. It is a podcast that I don't hate. The first episode was rough, and you heard why, but it certainly got better, and I can't wait to hear more episodes with Mark Paul Gosselaar on Zack to the Future. Next week, we'll be back with another celebrity guest. John Snee will be here. His name sounds familiar. He played Oliver Cleaver in the new Leave It To Beaver. He played Jerry Mather's son, and he will be here to share his memories of the show as our reunion of Leave It To Beaver continues. Kind of hoping to get Troy Davidson on the show. He played Wally's son. Ellen Maxted, who played Eddie's wife, and Giovanni Ribisi, who was Kelly's boyfriend, Duffy. Would like to get those three on the show to kind of close out our reunion of that series before we pick another one and start doing it. I think the cast of Punky Brewster would be fun to interview, so I might try and go after those guys, get them on the show. But if you have a sitcom that you want us, or a show from the 90s, 80s, whatever, if you want us to reunite that cast here on Fancounters, we can try and get that all set up, and would love to bring that to you. Just send those emails to hello@fancounters.com. A review on iTunes would go a long way. We'd love for you to review us and give us 5 stars. We'd appreciate that very much. And until next week, have a great week, everybody. Let's keep all of those with COVID in our prayers, and those affected by the loss of a loved one from COVID, as we continue to try and eradicate this disease in the United States. Stay safe and healthy, everybody. Have a great week. Talk to you next Friday. Bye-bye.
I'm telling you, I'm hooked.